Materials provided by Clay House Art.
Sculpting the head is really challenging because I think there's a lot of baggage that comes along with sculpting a face. Why do you think that is for a lot of people?
For me personally, I'm very picky with how my face looks, and I feel like I expect it to be symmetrical, but it never is.
Mhm.
So maybe that would come into play when you're sculpting a face and need to make it perfect when it really isn't.
There really is no version of a perfect head. To me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to even strive for that. The portrait sculptors that I think work best are the ones that really aim for a more exaggerated version. Sometimes when people try to just sculpt the head exactly as they see it, it ends up looking really understated. It almost has no life or expression to it. And I also think people are very judgmental when they look at a face. Just your average person can look at a sculpture and say, something's not quite right about these proportions. You don't even need an art history or studio art background to be able to pass judgment on a face.
We spend so much time looking at faces. I feel like it's the first thing you notice when you first meet someone is their face.
It's a means of communication for a lot of people when you make eye contact with somebody, when you meet someone for the first time.
So when I learned how to draw faces, I was taught to do the line system, like line down, line where the eyes are, line where the nose is, line where the mouth is, and then like the space between your eyes is the same as one length of your eye. There's all these little measurements you could use to proportion a face.
Did you find that helpful?
I found it almost too nitpicky. You get so caught up in making everything perfect that you kind of lose your voice in that.
A lot of those proportion systems, they really restrict your way of working. What I found much more valuable is just really sharpening your eye to observe forms. People ask me all the time, how do I do proportions? I really struggle with that. And they always go to that measuring system because it feels very stable and reliable. But I think proportions are all about noticing relationships. For example, the width of the cheekbone is much wider compared to the width of the eye, and yet it's a lot shorter than the width of the jawbone. That proportional relationship is much more important to observe than to measure. And let's face it, how many of us fit into that proportional system? There's always somebody, in fact, most of us, our bodies are just not made to be that way. So I'm not a fan of those systems at all. I really want people to just look very carefully. In terms of an armature, a head is so much easier to do than a figure because you don't have limbs that are sticking out. It doesn't have to stand on anything. Technically speaking, if I wanted to, I could just make it without an armature and it would be fine. But the thing is, the armature gives you stability, and also you can fill the armature with pieces of styrofoam and it cuts back a lot on the amount of clay. It's also not as heavy. There's just a lot of advantages to doing it that way. Just having a styrofoam ball, think about how much clay you're saving by putting this on the inside of the figure, and then also securing it to a base is also a really good idea. So you could, but I don't recommend it. I think it's much better to do it with an armature. You're going to take armature wire that's about 1/8 of an inch thick, and you want to measure it so that it wraps around styrofoam like that. So that's pretty good. Let's cut that down here. And you want 2 pieces of wire that are the same length. Go in, measure this so it's the exact same width.
How come you left so much extra?
Well, because if you have too much armature wire, it's really easy to just snip it. But if it's too short, it's a real pain to add extra wire. You can, it's not impossible, but it's like, why do that if you can avoid it really easily? Okay, now you're gonna make a cross, just like this. And I'm gonna take a 1/16 of an inch wide armature wire, cut that again very long, and you're gonna take the thin armature wire and wrap it around like this. This beginning part is really wobbly because I haven't wrapped anything just yet. So don't stress if this is feeling very unstable, because now I can wrap it this way, and I'll take this and wrap it the other way. And then I'm gonna trim that, you're gonna trim this. Now the next step is you're going to put this around the styrofoam ball. Okay, so do 2 first, just like that. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually leave this a little bit loose, because what happens sometimes if you make it too tight, the styrofoam ball will just pop out and then you have to unwrap the whole thing and start all over again. I'm going to twist it like down here. So you see this, it's like really easy to take it in and out. Now I want to secure the other 2 wires, which are going to go this way, and let that one poke out. Wrap this around. Okay, wrap that around. Okay, and now if I want to, I can twist this even more like that. And because I have the 4 pieces of wire really holding it in place, it's okay. If you touch it, it's really, really solid.
Yeah, that's not going anywhere.
No, not at all. Okay, so now you have to figure out how tall you want the neck to be. I like to make the neck a little bit on the longer side because I do like to show the shoulders, but I don't know, that's just a decision that I'm a little bit spontaneous about. Maybe some people like to plan it. I don't really care so much about that. And this is great because you have 4 pieces of wire. It's a really strong neck. I'm just going to hold the base up and just see how that's looking in terms of height. So if I imagine that the jawbone is here, here's the neck, I think I'm going to twist this a little bit more. I don't know, would you want to measure it? Or do you not care?
I'm a very precise person, so I probably would.
You would measure
just
it,
because
okay.
I need to control it.
Yeah. I guess it just depends on your personal taste. Okay, so let's flatten this. I'm just going to trim this one because it's crazy long, but these other ones I'm going to leave long because then I can trim them later. I think it's a good idea to just take your armature and just place it like this. And I'm going to trim it so it comes a little bit before the edge because you don't want this coming off. So let's just trim a little bit like that. It is helpful to take the hammer and just bang this flat because sometimes the wire's going upwards. I don't want to do that. There's lots of different ways you can attach the armature wire to the base. A lot of people like to use a heavy-duty staple gun because it's easy, you just punch it in. But I don't really like the heavy-duty staple guns for this because the staples, they're a little bit thin. They're not that strong. So instead, I just get these really short nails and I just bang them across the armature wire. I'm going to do this on the table for the demo, but I really advise that you do this on the floor because on a table like this, it's not going to work so well. You're going to take the nail and you're going to hit it in. You want to hit it in pretty deep. Don't bang your thumb, which I've done many times. Now you're going to take the nail and you're going to hit it across like this. So it bends over. Do you see how now the nail is starting to bend? So you want to go all the way. Now you're going to put a nail going from the other direction. You can see now that I've banged it on the floor, it was much easier to put the nails in. And this is pretty much what you want. It's pretty solid, even just with one leg put in. So you can imagine once you get the nails on all 4 legs, it's going to be really solid. There's one more part to the armature you want to add, which is called a butterfly. This is the bulk of the head. But then if you have the jaw, which is coming down like this, sometimes what happens is the clay just drops downwards because there's nothing holding it into place. So you're going to make something called a butterfly. This is a little bit tricky because it's so small, but basically you're going to take these 2 pieces of wood that are like this and you cross them like that. And you have a little piece of wire that hangs down. I'm going to take the 1/16 of an inch thick armature wire and you're going to find a spot on the sculpture where you can put the wire through like this. And you want to twist it around because like this, it's not very taut. So this is a little tricky because it's a piece of wire, not a piece of string. So it sometimes doesn't want to cooperate. But if you pull it through all the way, do you see how now there's a nice little loop in there? I'm going to move it up a little bit more. Eventually, the clay will hold this in place. So this is slipping right now, but the clay will take care of that. I'm going to twist these 2 pieces together. You don't want this piece of wire to be too long because if it gets too long, it'll go past the chin, which is bad. So it's better to err on this piece being too short. I'm just going to eyeball that. Okay. Now you're going to take your 2 pieces of wood. Okay, so this becomes like a little cross. This is a little bit tricky, but you're gonna wrap this around. This is much easier on a big sculpture because you can make a butterfly that actually is easy to manage. This one's a little bit hard because it's so tiny.
Yeah.
In fact, I might just do one piece of wood
Okay.
instead of the cross. Maybe that's enough. Snip that. This. There's your butterfly. And you can see I can move it up. Another thing that's very helpful is to fill around the neck with a little bit of styrofoam, because that will save you a lot of clay. There's a lot of clay that would have to go here. You can use any kind of styrofoam. I happen to like this styrofoam because it's really easy to cut. I'm gonna just take this utility knife. We're gonna see, yeah, that's about the right height. Take that. See, that's probably a little bit too much. So I think I'm gonna cut this in half.
It's so satisfying when it cuts.
It is. It's really fun to cut. And what I'll do is pack clay inside. This styrofoam is soft enough that I can press it into the wire. I think I'm going to put one here for the shoulder. So do you see how this starts to fill in a little bit more of the body?
I'm curious to see what kind of clay you use for this, because in my experience, when I've used air dry clays like Model Magic, I found that it's extremely light and all the edges are very rounded. It's like you're working with marshmallow and then it cracks when it dries, which is just awful.
Yeah, air dry clay traditionally has been just the worst material on the planet. I avoid it like the plague. The clay that I've used, it tries to be ceramic clay, but it fails in every possible way, in that it smells bad, it's sticky, it gets on your fingers, and it's really heavy to the point that it becomes inconvenient. You can't really sculpt anything on a bigger scale. And also, it's an ugly color. A lot of it is this like puke brown color, or it's this ugly sterile gray, and it's just not fun. However, I discovered Clay House Art, and they specialize in air dry clay. And I've been very impressed with their clay because it is very easy to work with. It feels good on your hands. And when it dries, it does not crack, which is a miracle in my opinion, because isn't that what air dry clay is known for, is that it just cracks? And also, if I tried to put air dry clay on top of this, it would definitely crack. But this air dry clay, it sticks to everything. You can put it on wood, you can put it on wire. It's just a really stable material to be working with. So I really enjoyed this a lot. Also, this terracotta version, it has a little bit of a grit, almost like the ceramic clay that has grog in it, which I love. I love that texture and surface. And so air dry clay is such a great solution because if you use ceramic clay, you need a kiln. And how many people have access to a kiln? Or if you sculpt it in, say, plastiline, you have to make a plaster waste mold, you got to cast it in plaster, and even plaster is not a permanent material. If you really want it to be permanent, you got to cast it in bronze. And how many of us really want to bother with that? So this is really nice if you want a sculpture that's permanent, that's not going to crack, and it's fast. There are a couple things to be aware of, though, when you use air dry clay. One of them is that air dry clay does basically start drying the second you start using it. It stays really nice and fresh, I would say, for the first hour or so. But beyond that, you will notice that eventually the surface starts to set up a little bit. One thing that I've done is to dig beneath that surface to expose the fresh clay underneath, and you can just pinch it off. Mostly you need to work additively. It works really well because you can always add fresh clay to dried out clay. It sticks to itself, which is great. But if you're somebody who likes to carve into the clay, it's not so great for that because you have to have fresh clay to do that. What I do usually, if I want to carve something, I'll put the fresh clay on and then carve it right away. Because if I wait 3 hours, that's going to be dry and then I can't carve out of it as easily as if it were fresh. You do have to somewhat adjust your sculpting technique. And you will get to a point after you've worked on it for about 3 or 4 hours that it's just going to dry. So this is not good if you're a slow worker, if you need 20 hours to do, but it is a good test run if you just want to see, oh, do I like figure modeling? Is this something I want to do? In the beginning of the sculpture, you don't even have to look at your reference photos. All you need to do is just pack the clay on. Here, there's a little bit of space between my styrofoam and my wire. So what I may want to do is actually take the styrofoam off and put clay around this first, and then push the styrofoam into the clay because the clay is sticky and the styrofoam will go into it. So if I take this, I can press this. Oh, actually, you know what I should do? Take all the styrofoam off, put clay around this, so that way the styrofoam will have something to adhere to. Press this into the clay. See how I'm pushing the clay right up against it?
Mm-hmm.
And now it fits nice and snug. And I'll put some clay in between two pieces of styrofoam. The whole point of this is you have to pack, because if you have like a space of air in between, it's not going to be very stable. Okay, so if you touch that, you can see it's pretty stable.
Oh, wow, that's very dense.
Yeah. It is. And think about how much clay you're saving. See what a mess this is?
Mm-hmm.
It looks so bad right now, but that's okay. Now we have this Frankenstein of a sculpture that we're going to start building clay on top of. I think it's really good to do this part as quickly as possible, because this is the grunt work. And sometimes what I see is students want to start sculpting even at this stage, and it's not worth it, because until you have the entire armature covered, you can't do anything.
Yeah,
in
you
terms
really
of sculpting
can't
it.
start with the details.
No.
Which I notice a lot of students tend to do.
Well, I think details are what impress people. You hear people say things like, wow, that piece was so detailed, that's so amazing. And yeah, details can do a lot for a piece. But I think especially for something like sculpture, you have to have this structure in place. If you make a bad armature, you're going to pay for it later. Trust me. And it stinks to have to go back and cut things open, which I've done actually on a number of occasions where something really was wrong, and it's not fun. This is one of those processes you just don't want to have to backtrack. You'll also notice that I'm just packing this on as quickly as possible. I'm not trying to make it look good. And one of the reasons you want to do that is because this is air dry clay, you don't want to sit around and take forever working on this, because you're sort of working on a deadline in a way when it comes to air dry clay. You don't have the luxury of just working on it forever and ever. If you're one of those types of people, I would say plastiline would be a much better choice.
Right now, the sculpture kind of looks like dog food, like canned dog food.
Yeah, it looks pretty crappy right now, actually.
Yeah, and it seems like it's taking a really long time for it to progress out of that stage. Would you say so?
Yeah, I think when you work with sculpture, or really any 3D material, you have to be prepared for your sculpture to look really bad for a long time. It could be 3 hours before you get anything that looks remotely decent. But that's just the process. It's not you. It's not because you're slow. It just takes a while. And what I see sometimes is when students have a lot of experience drawing, especially gesture drawing, where you can throw down a figure in 2 minutes, they expect the same immediate results in sculpture, and you just can't. You have to have the patience. You have to have faith that if you continue to work on it, it will get better.
I had a class where someone was drawing on the features.
Like literally outlining the nose?
We were sculpting. We were in a sculpting class, and someone was drawing on the eyes, drawing on the nose.
I think three-dimensional artwork feels more foreign to people than, for example, a drawing or a painting. And it's weird because we live in a 3D world. You wouldn't think it would be such a big leap. My guess is that that was that student's way of translating what they know in 2D onto their 3D piece. But the thing is, you can't think about it that way. And that's why you'll probably notice that I'm constantly turning my sculpture. And the reason you do that is because you can spend a long time working on one side of the sculpture and it might look really good. But then when you switch to another side, you realize, oh, shoot, that part of the figure that I thought was so small is actually so much bigger from this view. So turning around the figure constantly, it makes it so that you have transitions from one side to the next. You're not just working front, side, back. Because ideally, a really strong sculpture looks engaging from every point of view. You shouldn't feel like there's a front or back, that is just one fluid motion.
Well, if you are just going from observation, how do you know where to start?
I think the most important thing is to identify the largest forms In this case, it would be the bulk of the head. Or people will leave the neck totally untouched. And so the problem I see is people put all of their focus on the features of the face. They don't think about anything else. So I try to do a more holistic approach to the figure. You address the neck, then you jump to the head, then you jump to the shoulders. You're moving around and navigating throughout the entire space.
When you're sculpting a portrait or a bust, are you looking for anatomy points? Are you looking for specific anatomical points on the body?
I think it really does help to observe a skull and to understand what the major bones are in that area. In fact, when I was in art school, I had a teacher who had us actually sculpt a skull out of clay. And that was a really good exercise because it got you to really look at the individual parts of the skull to really identify some of the forms. And if you have that as an exercise first, and then you go to sculpt the head, it actually works out really well. For me, the most important bony landmarks would definitely be the eye sockets. Because again, people look at the eyes and they just focus on the eyeball and the eyelids. They don't think about the shape that's surrounding it, which is actually much more important because you can't have an eyeball if you have no eye socket. The cheekbones are really important because they're very prominent on most people. That's a bone called the zygomatic arch. And then also the jawbone, hugely important because that really anchors the lower part of the face. And then I would even say the ear, because the ear is not a bony landmark. It's all cartilage. But the thing is, the ear is like this intersection where you have the zygomatic arch moving into the ear, and then you connect the jawbone. So if you find the cheekbone, the jawbone, and the ear, those three things come together. And then that helps you locate everything else. So that's a great area to search for when you're looking at a portrait.
Do you include the neck? Do you include the shoulders? Or do I just cut it off here?
I guess that's a personal decision, how much you want to sculpt. I personally really like to include the neck because the neck really turns the head. So if you're doing a head that's tilted like this, there's a muscle right here called the sternocleidomastoid, and it starts behind the ear and it attaches to the pit of the neck. And so this is a great landmark for the neck. And it only pops out if you turn the head. Like if I face you like this, you don't really see that muscle very prominently. And so it really says something about the tilt and orientation of the head. I also think things like the collarbones are really useful because the collarbones are attached to the pit of the neck. And a lot of anatomy is like that. It's like connect the dots. It's like find this thing, find that thing, connect them together. And when you think about it, if you can just locate those landmarks, everything falls into place. I like to include at least a little bit of the shoulders. I think sometimes when you start to get a little bit too low and it's like halfway up your upper arm, sometimes that becomes a problem because then you're missing half the chest and it feels like there should be something there, but there isn't. So I like to cut it like a little bit underneath the collarbones, show a little bit of this muscle here, which is called the deltoid, and that seems to be sufficient. We have a round base that I'm going to put the sculpture on, and so I can orient the figure however I want. I don't tend to like square bases for portraits because it makes you feel like there's a front and a back to the sculpture, but with a circle, you can't really figure out where the front or the back is. Strong sculptures look good from every angle. If you look at a sculpture and one angle is really exciting and wonderful to look at, and then you turn it around and you're just bored to death, that's not a good thing. You want it to look great and interesting from every angle.
When I look at the face, the first thing I'm drawn to are often the nose and the mouth.
Well, the thing that's tricky about the nose and the mouth is that if you think about it, the nose is just cartilage and the lips are just soft tissue. So there's nothing really structural about those two forms. I think the most important thing with the lip is to sculpt the dividing line between the upper lip and the lower lip, because that determines where both of the lips are. With the nose, I really place it in relation to the eyes, because the nose is in between the eyes. And I also look for the width of the nose in relation to the width of the mouth, because the mouth is always wider than the nose. I've never really seen anybody for whom it's the opposite. And so that's a proportional relationship that I know I can rely on. You start looking at, okay, well, where is the cheekbone related to the nose? So it's just all these relationships. And eventually, when you start to address all of them all at once, it all starts to sink in. Of course, there's a lot of adjusting. You might sculpt the cheekbone and then realize, oh, shoot, it has to be a little bit higher. But that's ongoing when you're sculpting a portrait. You just are constantly reevaluating, always tweaking and adjusting. And that's fine. That's just part of the process.
I've worked with a lot of live models, and all of them tend to have different personalities or different characteristics. And I feel like it tends to show up in my work as well. Does the same happen to you?
Oh, totally. I feel like when I'm working with a live model, I try to figure out what makes them distinctive, what makes them unique. And I try to really push that in the sculpture as much as I can. On the other hand, it's remarkable to me that you could have a class of students. There's 20 students. They're all sculpting the exact same person. And you're going to get 20 totally different interpretations. I've seen students draw the same model. One of them draws the model very angry. Another person draws the model very calm, serene. Another person will sculpt the model so that they look very tired and exhausted. But I love that. I love that everybody can bring their own interpretation to every model. For me, the most important thing is that however I end up sculpting, my sculpture feels like an individual person, that it doesn't feel generic. And I think that's where specific things like wrinkles or even warts and things like that, I think are great to show. Oftentimes when people look at a sculpture, they're really just engaging with the face. But if you think about it, the face is actually only a small portion of the head. There's actually a lot of form behind the face, and people forget about that. So in a portrait sculpture, it's really important to remember that the face is just one part of the entire form. I think putting in things like the hair is really important, because what I see a lot is people will sculpt this beautiful face, but they won't sculpt the hair until the very last minute. And that doesn't make any sense, because then the hair ends up feeling like a wig because it was never integrated with the form.
So when you get to the hair, you're not going to put in every single little hair, are you?
No, you can't. There's just no way. I mean, there's probably, millions of strands of hair on your head. I've had students in my classes where they'll sculpt the bulk of the hair. Then they'll take one of these needle tools and they'll literally draw lines on top of the sculpture. It always looks terrible and it always looks flat. The way to really do the hair is to look at the direction that the hair is moving in. For example, maybe the hair is moving in this direction. Maybe it's going that way. So search for that first. And then you look for clumps of hair. So you might have a clump that's doing this, another clump that's doing this. You don't look for the individual strands. You just can't do that. And then maybe when I'm all done with the little clumps of hair, I might go in with the needle tool then and do just a couple marks, nothing substantial, but just to give it a little bit more texture so it's not too smooth.
So Game of Thrones is on in like 15 minutes. Can I just leave this and come back?
Well, you can't, because once the clay is exposed to the air, it's going to start the drawing process. You can't do that. What you can do, though, is take a plastic bag, cover the sculpture like this, pick it up like this, get the end of it so that it's on the bottom, place it down like this, and now it's airtight. So now you can go watch Game of Thrones and not worry about your sculpture drying out. I really want the clay to do what it wants to do. I don't want to try to force the clay to be something it's not. Although you can argue that somebody like Bernini did that. He took marble, which is the hardest surface you can ever think of, and he made it very fluid with all the drapery in his sculptures. But I don't tend to work that way. I'm somebody who wants to say, okay, what is this clay's special talents, and how can I highlight those talents? For me, I'm actually pushing the roughness of the sculpture, and I'm embracing that as much as I can, which is fun because the clay wants to do it, and I'm just along for the ride.
I've also seen people put water on their clay.
To keep it moist.
To keep it moist, and also to smooth out the surface. Can you do that with this clay?
You can't. I mean, this clay, to my knowledge, doesn't really work with water. And I think the way to consider it is that certain materials have very specific properties. This material doesn't want to be smooth and shiny. It really wants to be rough, almost primitive. I mean, I feel like I'm constructing a world here when I start modeling with it.
This piece has only been drying for 12 hours, but it already feels super hard and super stiff.
That's what I like about this clay, is that even at this early stage of drying, it's still pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
This is a pretty thick sculpture. I think I'd give it a good 4 days to completely dry out. But what's remarkable about this clay is even though this is super dry and hard, you can take fresh clay and you can just stick this on top. And if you blend it into the surface, it will stick to itself. So even though this is dry, you're not really done yet if you don't want to be. I could go in and I could tweak little things, and you can't go back and carve. That's pretty much over, but you can definitely add. And there's so few clays for which that's a possibility. So I would take advantage of that as much as you could.
It seems like if you have a little patience with this process, you can get some really amazing results that are also very permanent.
That's really unique to this particular brand of clay, because I have so many plaster sculptures all around my house that I worry about, because I think, oh no, if it gets scuffed or it gets touched, it's going to get ruined. And with this sculpture, I know that that's not going to be an issue. And it's rare to have a sculpture material that is inherently permanent without having to do all kinds of things like the kiln or casting process. So I think this is a really nice process, because from beginning to end, you know you're ending with something which is very final. And that's not very common in the sculpture world. So I'm excited about that. What voodoo doll? Oh wait, this is the one of me.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do with the voodoo doll?
It's my new pincushion and really stiff. What else should I say?
This clay is quite remarkable.
Remarkable.
Shut up. Start again.
Okay. What's this?
What was that face?